Bonnets, weddings, and feelings, oh my. Hello, and welcome to my crash course on Pride and Prejudice, written by the 19th century feminist writer Jane Austen. Jane Austen, born in 1775, was a feminist of her time by avoiding the societal expectation of marrying and spent her life unmarried and writing, which was seen as vulgar for the class she was associated with. Austen published Pride and Prejudice on January 28, 1813, critiquing the societal norms of love and marriage for women in the 1800s. The story begins with the Bennets, a family of 5 daughters, and Mrs. and Mr. Bennet. The beginning of the story highlights the importance of the daughters having to be married, since none of the estate will be left for the daughters, but instead the first male cousin in line after their father. You have Elizabeth, Jane, Mary, Lydia, and Kitty, whom are the 5 daughters of Mrs. and Mr. Bennet. Austen immediately sets the characters with the personalities of the daughters. Elizabeth, witty and independent. Jane, a half-glass full type of gal. Mary, painfully dull and annoyingly studious. Kitty, heavily influenced by those whom surround her. And finally, Lydia, simply being the wild child. And so the story begins. In a very basic summary, here's how the story goes. Mr. Bingley, a lively joy of a character, moves to Netherfield. He is the ideal man to marry, and exactly who Mrs. Bennet is overjoyed about. Bingley invites the Bennets to his residence and takes a liking to Jane, to whom he dances not once with, but twice with, marking the start of the relationship between Jane and Bingley. Bingley brought his best friend Mr. Darcy, whom all are super interested in since he is handsome, but more importantly, rich. However, as soon as people are interested, they turn away due to the ridiculous amount of pride Darcy has instilled in himself. Darcy will not dance with any other women at the ball, and when Bingley tries to get Darcy to dance with Elizabeth, Darcy promptly discards her and says that she does not tempt his mind to dance with her, starting Elizabeth's prejudice towards Darcy. Jane and Bingley's relationship progresses. Jane is sick at Bingley, so Elizabeth walks 3 miles with pride to Netherfield to take care of Jane. Lizzie walking to Netherfield is a scandal between Caroline Bingley and Mrs. Hurst. Darcy describes the accomplishments of an accomplished woman, to which Lizzie pridefully responds with confidence to Darcy, saying, "I never saw such a woman." And comes Mr. Collins, the man to inherit the Bennet estate, to Longbourn to try and marry one of the Bennet daughters. He proposes to Lizzie and gets tragically rejected, as he should be, then moves to Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's bestie, who accepts and they get married. Update on Jane and Bingley. Bingley is in London now, and Jane hopefully follows to get Bingley's attention. Lizzie suspects Darcy to be the culprit in tearing them apart. Enter Mr. Wickham, a soldier who has charmed Lizzie and tells of his misfortune with Darcy, which strengthens Lizzie's prejudice against Darcy. Darcy, however, is falling for Miss Elizabeth Bennet, and when Lizzie visits Charlotte, he professes his love to Lizzie, whom replies with extreme distaste out of the building prejudice throughout the novel so far. Darcy responds with a rebuttal to her explanation of no, addressing Wickham and his lies, and the confession of separating Jane and Bingley through a letter which enlightens Elizabeth to the reality of the situation. Fast forward, and now Lizzie is visiting Pemberley while Darcy is out of town. She thinks she is alone, and she is very much not. Her and Darcy meet again, and Darcy's manners have increased splendidly, and Elizabeth's feelings toward Darcy have begun to grow. Now the drama begins. Jane sends a letter to Lizzie while she's in Pemberley, telling of how Lydia has run off with Wickham and they cannot find the two. Mr. Bennet and Mr. Gardiner search for Lydia. Mr. Bennet basically gives up while Mr. Gardiner finds them. However, what they don't know is that Darcy has paid off Wickham to marry Lydia to save Elizabeth's reputation. A secret declaration of love, if I may say so myself. Bingley and Darcy soon return back to Longbourn after the scandal, and Bingley comes back to propose to Jane. Elizabeth, with her newfound feelings for Darcy, finds out about the way Darcy paid off Wickham for her, and her prejudice against Darcy has substantially decreased, along with Darcy's pride in himself as he longs to please Lizzie. Darcy comes back to Elizabeth, stating that his feelings still have not changed and still wants Elizabeth's hand in marriage. Lizzie joyfully accepts, and then they get married. Then you have the end of the book. That's literally it. It just closes all the conflict and then you're done reading it. Now, what does this mean? What is Austen trying to convince the reader to think? That is what I am here to show you. The book itself has an extreme amount of irony. Darcy professes his love to Elizabeth and how her status doesn't matter to him. Quote, his sense of her inferiority, of its being a degradation, of the family obstacles which judgment had always opposed to inclination, were dwelt on with a warmth which seemed due to the consequence he was wounding, but was very unlikely to recommend his suit. Austen 170. Even though her status and family is the reason he separates Bingley and Jane in the first place. Quote, with assumed tranquility he then replied, I have no wish of denying that I did everything in my power to separate my friend from your sister, or that I rejoice in my success. Toward him I have been kinder than toward myself. Austen 171, cue the eye roll. You also have this whole idea in the novel to get married for love, not money. And then the two main daughters become rich when they end up marrying for love, which I find very ironic. Even Mrs. Bennet's reaction to Lydia getting married after she ran away and quite literally almost ruined the entire family's reputation. Quote, my dear, dear Lydia, she cried, this is delightful indeed. She will be married. I shall see her again. She will be married at 16. Austen 258. It's like you almost want to slap Mrs. Bennet in the face, even though it literally is the only thing left in her life to do, marry off her daughters. Different topic to discuss, though. Why does Austen have so much irony? To make fun of the societal standards in her time period. Why else would you have so much satire in a book? Jane Austen pokes fun at the way women have to marry in order to live and be accomplished, and how the whole marriage process in society is overly exaggerated. Mrs. Bennet screams at the beginning of the book that Bingley is such an establishment for her daughters, and that she just has to go see Mr. Bingley to present her daughters, whom will certainly have the possibility of love with Bingley. You have so many characters that show this exaggeration Austen is portraying in the book. You have Lady Catherine, who is overly prideful in herself and her family, using her stance in society to rule over all those underneath her. Austen uses her character to make fun of people in rich society who seem to think that just because they have money and status, they can decide what is acceptable or not and how ridiculous that is. The reader can clearly see that when Lady Catherine constantly questions Elizabeth and her upbringing. Even those who aren't rich to the standard of Lady Catherine still kneel to the rich in the book. Mr. Collins is constantly bragging of his connection to Lady Catherine and how great she is, and Austen writes him as if he has nothing other to do than worship the ground she walks on. As you can see in page 147, quote, he took his seat at the bottom of the table by her ladyship's desire and looked as if he felt that life could furnish nothing greater. Austen 147. The last example of irony I felt was found most fitting for the novel, and Austen's way of critiquing her society is the simple fact that all of the proposals in the book that are successful have almost zero writing. For example, when Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth, his proposal is literally 4 pages long, and most of it is Mr. Collins bragging about how cool he is. While when Bingley proposes to Jane, it is maybe almost a half a page with no dialogue between the two. I think this perfectly portrays Austen's viewpoint of how marriage and being in society in her time period was so overly dramatic and exaggerated. By adding so much irony in certain situations in the book, you as a reader can almost feel the snide remarks against the overly social aspect of being married in the 1800s and why Austen disliked it so much. And that is why I think Austen uses irony in Pride and Prejudice, to show all the different crazy ways the society in her time period worked, and how frustrated she was with it. That is one of the reasons why I really enjoyed the book. After reading it and going through it again before the crash course, I started to realize the feminism behind the book and why it is so important today and why literature still teaches it. Whether you like classics or not, this book is a spark of feminism and time period that was deeply rooted against it, and I think that's why Austen uses irony and just the way society works as her book topic. It's something that we need to keep learning, and it was really one of the reasons why I thoroughly enjoyed the book. It really is a classic piece. So, thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the crash course. Bye!